This conference will now be recorded.
Yes, welcome back everyone. So in the last segment, we had looked into a couple of Scrum fundamental based concepts. Like we looked into what are the, sorry, let me just quickly get into this. Yeah, we looked into Scrum ceremonies and we looked into Scrum roles. Now we'll just have a sort of a continuation of it to know a little bit more about few things which are a must for a business analyst to be aware of. Okay. So first thing of it is the iterative model. Do not, okay, before even we get started into this, I want to suggest something to all the BA aspirants out there that whenever at work or at interview, if you come across any term which you are totally unaware of, do not get confused or do not think that, oh my God, what is this? I never heard about this. This is for the first time I'm hearing and it looks like a very complex term. No, to not react in that way because uh, the fact is that there are a lot of things which you might be doing as part of your project, but you may not be aware that okay, this is the term that is used for it. Okay, so whenever you come across something, you just say that okay, I'm not aware of it because I might have been doing it in my previous projects, but we were not using this terminology. Let me get back to you, and then you do a basic Google search and you will get to know that okay, this is not something rocket science, which is pretty much simple. Trust me when I say this, I'm saying you that most of the things that you do as a BA are pretty much easy to understand. It's only about how do you implement it that brings the difference. Okay, so coming back to our term, iterative model. So what is iterative model? So when you have a particular process in place wherein you have a predefined set of steps to be followed, like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then you know what happens once you have followed this sequence from 1 2 3 to 4, then what happens, you again go back to step 1 and then you do 2 3 4 again. After the end of 4 you go back. So this sort of repetitive process is nothing but it is known as a iterative model. Okay, and how is it relevant to your project? So if you remember, in Agile, in Scrum framework, what do? We follow a sprint model. Means sprint one. In the sprint one, we have a duration of 2 weeks, which is roughly 10 working days, right? So in these 10 working days, you start with the sprint planning, then you go with daily stand-up meetings, then you have your sprint review or a sprint demo, and then you end it up with sprint retrospective. So your sprint one is over. Then what you do? You go to sprint two. What happens in sprint 2? Again, sprint planning, daily stand up, review, followed by retrospective. Then sprint 3, followed by 4, 5, 6. So, this is what happens in your agile scrum based project. That is what is referred to as your iterative model, nothing more than that. You're repeating a set of steps in a sequential model so that at the end of every sprint, you have a deliverable ready to be showcased to the client or the stakeholders. Okay. So just be aware that there is a term called iterative model, which is nothing but this. Okay. The next thing is the product backlog. Now this might be a very new term. Again, how do you define this is, okay, let's go to our story mapping. So if you remember, so here if you see, I had given an example of take up any particular project. You have at a very high level, you have something called as epic. Then you have multiple features within an epic, and within every feature you'll have multiple user stories. So at the beginning of your project, you might have a list of user stories. Maybe depending on the size of the project, it could be just around 20 or 25, or if it is a bigger project, there could be many more. And you will not have the exact list of user stories, but at least a tentative list you'll have. Okay, now say if you have around, say, minimal, you have just 10 user stories, will you pick up all of those 10 user stories in your sprint one? No, right? So what do? You place all of these user stories in a particular, consider it to be like a folder. Okay, there is a folder where you have multiple Word documents, each Word document being one user story. Okay, so in this folder You have 10 user stories, means 10 Word docs right now. Okay. And now when your sprint one is starting, what do? Out of these 10 user stories, you pick up the high priority ones, which could be like top four or top five, right? So how do you do that? So that is known as your, first of all, that folder which has the list of all the user stories, that would be referred to as your product backlog, which means a repository of all the features, all the user stories that should be delivered as part of the project. When you place all of those together in a what do you say, categorized, or in a prioritized manner, like the top few user stories are the highest priority ones, the last at the end which are there, those are the least priority ones. So that priority based list of user stories which you have, that is referred to as your product backlog. Now what happens is, let's say that at your initial part of your project you had a product backlog in place, and where you placed your whatever 10 or 15 or 20 user stories and all. Then what happened is, in between the project, maybe some new features have come up which have got a higher priority. Then there were other user stories which are existing which had to be removed altogether. So you're deprioritizing the user stories. So this sort of thing happens. Then you need to also make sure that your backlog is revised at regular intervals, maybe once in 2 weeks or once in a month. It depends. Again, it depends on the project, it depends on the stakeholders, it depends on the type of deliverable that you're going to provide to the stakeholders. So a lot of factors are there which determine this. But the point is, you have something called as a product backlog, which is a list of all the user stories in a prioritized manner that you place. And then at regular intervals, based on your discussion as a business analyst with the product owner or with the stakeholders, you get to revise the priority levels of these user stories and add new user stories if required. So that particular process is known as your backlog grooming. Okay, that's it. There is no rocket science in this. You're just ensuring that when you are part of a particular project, you are working on the highest priority items every time, meanwhile not ignoring, or you're duly considering all the additional requests or additional features or user stories that come as part of your project. That is all about it. Okay, the next thing is something called as definition of done. So what is definition of done? Let's say there's a user story. Now let us take the user story example here. Okay, um, say you have a user story for create account. Okay, so you have, as a BA, you have created a user story for create account. What do? You remember, you write it in as a I want to, so that template followed by the conditions which will be part of your acceptance criteria, right? So you have written these points. Similarly, you have written another user story for login through Google. Then you've written another user story for login through PIN, login through username and password. Like that, you had around, say, 5 user stories. Now, every user story will have its own set of conditions, which you mentioned in the acceptance criteria. For example, create account, the condition would be that customers should be entering these information while creating the account. And if the customers, the username that the customer selected is already used, then you have to suggest customer to use a new one, and things like that. You can have few points in the acceptance criteria. Similarly, login through Google can have its own acceptance criteria. This again on, this again on. But then there will be a certain set of terms and conditions which will be common across multiple user stories. Okay. For example, for example, before going to sprint review, the user story should be thoroughly tested, and the QA should give a sign off on that particular user story. Now, this is required for every user story, right? This is one point. The second point can be that once the user story has been thoroughly tested, the business analyst has to validate the functionality of that user story and provide a confirmation that yes, it is working fine. It will be again required for each and every of these user story. Okay. The third thing can be that the user story should be part of, how to put it, say the user story should have the entire list of conditions properly documented in the acceptance criteria for the user story. That can be one more condition. So let's say that you have a checklist like this, which is applicable for each and every user story, that it has to go follow these particular steps in order to reach the final state of done, or it should be thoroughly tested, or it should be thoroughly validated, and all these things when you put a checklist. Okay, and you say that every user story should have passed through each of these conditions mentioned in the checklist, only then I will consider this user story to be complete. That checklist is something which is referred to as definition of done. That's it. Okay. Again, what I'm saying is, in your user stories, there'll be a set of points which will be mandatory for every user story to be followed through. So when you prepare a checklist of such conditions, that will be referred to as definition of done. And after that, whenever any user story is mentioned by the technical team that yes, we have completed thoroughly developing and testing, then you will use this definition of done and you'll ask these questions: is it thoroughly tested, is it validated, is it like this, like that, and all. So you have maybe 3 or 5 or 10 conditions in that checklist. You will check if your user story is meeting all these conditions. Only when it has met all of these conditions, then you refer that particular user story as meeting the definition of done. Okay, so that is it. Definition of done is pretty much more often used term in your agile projects. Similarly, there's something called as definition of ready, which is not that much used. But to just give you a gist of what is definition of ready, it is nothing but when can you assign a user story to the developers to start working on. You can do it when your user story has all the required information included in it, right? So that would be, for that again there could be a checklist, like your user story should have proper user story mapping to a feature and an epic, and it should have got validated by the product owner, and then it should have the acceptance criteria in the defined format, and then it should have got the proper enumeration in the agile collaboration tool like Jira or Asana. All these things could be part of your checklist for the definition of ready. Means once your user story has met all these conditions, only then the technical team will pick it up for the development purpose. So that checklist is known as definition of ready. Whereas the the checklist which ensures that your user story is completely done and is in a state where it can be taken to the stakeholders, that checklist would be referred as definition of done. Okay, do not get worried if you're confused, because these things are something which you should be knowing, and once you start getting into the project, right, you will eventually get into that groove. You will start using it day in and day out, and you'll get more and more aware of these terms. Then it'll be easy. Okay. And again, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of how it might look. So here, if you see, do not get confused by this Kanban board and all, because in Agile, whatever works for the project, in making the project more effective, you can use all of those tools, those terminologies and all. So based on that, Kanban is another framework, Scrum is one framework. So these are two different frameworks, but you can use some terms and terminologies from Kanban into Scrum and vice versa. Okay, so your focus should be more on these particular 4 columns that you see. So what you see here: to do, in progress, testing, and done. So what happens is, initially the list of user stories that have been picked up to be completed in that particular sprint. Let's say you're in sprint number 5, and there are 4 user stories which have been picked up. When you discussed with the technical team, all have aligned and agreed that these 4 user stories we can complete in this sprint. So what happens? First, all of those 4 user stories will fall into this to do bucket. Okay, and then what happens on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, like that? What happens is, one of these user stories get picked up by the development team. So then it can then it will be no more in to do state, it will be in progress, because development team has already started working on it. Similarly, on day 3, maybe one more user story has got picked up, so again that will be pushed from here to here. Okay, then what happens in due course of time, maybe after day 4 or day 5, one of these user stories has been thoroughly developed. Now the team will say it is ready for testing, so it will be pushed here, it goes into testing. And once the testing team also confirms that yes, we have tested, it is working very well, there is no problem at all, then it gets pushed into the done state. In fact, you can have one more column in between testing and done, wherein, if the testing is done by the QA team, they identified that there is a user story which is not really working as expected, then what they do is they push it back to that particular intermediate state. Or sometimes what happens is they are not able to test due to some reason, or there is some required tool or something is not available, then that gets into blocked state. Okay, so intermediate state could be that blocked state where you'll push those user stories which cannot be developed, cannot be tested, it is in a blocked state. Okay, so it becomes responsibility of the scrum master to make sure that whatever blockage is there due to any reason, that has to be resolved, and all that things will happen. And once that is done, then it goes back to in progress again, redeveloped by the tester, then again pushed in, redeveloped by the developer, then pushed into testing. And then when it is done, it comes into done state. So this is the typical approach which is used in most of the agile projects. Okay, so I hope we are clear with all of these things. Now that you have completed a little bit of understanding on Scrum fundamentals, as I mentioned, if you get into details of Scrum, details of Agile, that becomes again, an extensive course altogether. Um, if you want, maybe you can approach me and we can see if that would be required for you, and how to take it up, because that's a different course. I have a different set of videos for that. But typically from a BS perspective, these things should be more or less enough for you to understand. So maybe you can spend a little bit more time of on available resources to learn more about these things. So what we have done is we have focused on illustrative example, then looked into Scrum fundamentals. Now is the time for us to start our capstone project. Okay. So what we do right now is we look at a particular project, and here I would be providing you the details, but the expectation is that even before you start looking into that information, you should put a proper thought process into how you would work on it as a business analyst. And once you have done your homework, then you look into the segments according to it, and then you'll learn much better, and that will help you great deal, not just for your interview, for your work as a business analyst also. Okay, so we'll start with our capstone project in the next segment. Thanks everyone.